like you to just take a few minutes to explain or just talk about what kind of progress did we make after, or lack of progress. Where are we now at this moment compared to then? Do we have any safeguards? Do we have any restraints?
I would say it is as dangerous as it has ever been, which has always been much more dangerous than almost anyone realized, including me when I was in the Pentagon. But the possibility for accidents, for false alarms, for people not backing down. By the way, in '62, you know, I was so wrong at that situation in many ways, but I was 5 years out of the Marine Corps. I was an infantry commander, company commander, very proud of the fact I was the only first lieutenant who had a rifle company in the 2nd Marine Division, and peacetime. And I'd never been in a war. And if I learned one thing in Vietnam, I learned a number of things. People don't back down when they should. And they are less cautious than they should be. And they will kill almost any number of people to avoid losing face, losing office, losing status, losing membership. What I learned, of course, in the nuclear situation already, in Cuban Missile Crisis and elsewhere, men in power were willing to risk an indefinitely large number of lives. We're talking about nuclear war here, indefinitely large. Risk it to avoid backing down on a commitment, avoiding losing political support, being embarrassed, this and that. It seems like trivial reasons for taking chances, you know. But that's human. That's what people in power do, and people who put them there or help put them there go along with it. And that is absolutely true right now. Comparing the two situations right now, for example, a war with North Korea cannot cause nuclear winter. They're the one member of 9 nuclear weapon states that doesn't have enough nuclear power. They have 20, 40, 60 at the most fission weapons like Nagasaki. You can kill millions of people in days. More violence in a war with North Korea than the world has ever seen in a day or a week, ever. But not what we've been talking about here. In scale respect, very different from the Cuban Missile Crisis. But, and to be blunt but absolutely realistic here, not enough flammable cities aside from Pyongyang in North Korea, tell me if I'm wrong, to cause a nuclear winter. There's just not enough. We burned North Korea to the ground in 1950, 51, actually, without using nuclear weapons. We rebuilt, but nuclear winter is not the problem. Only a change of the world for the worse in the way of proliferation and testing and Cold War and real war and everything, a disaster. In Cuba, I came to conclude after 40 years of research on this, really, in which I learned that nearly everything I thought during the crisis had been wrong in various ways. But learning that over the years, I've come to conclude rather unusually, there aren't too many other references, that neither of these leaders had any intention of allowing this to come to armed conflict. They were determined, I believe, and I won't argue the case here, but I believe that each of them, Khrushchev and Kennedy, were bluffing, and that they were determined, they were willing, I should say, to end the crisis on the other's terms if necessary, but not yet. Wait another day, see if the terms can be improved. And yet, I'm saying these two people, and totally unlike Donald Trump or Kim Jong-un either, determined not to come to war, but jockeying, playing nuclear chicken, but determined to swerve before you go over the cliff or before you run into each other, with civilization in the back seat in each one, going at this, and yet they came within a hair's breadth of blowing the world up. Now we come to this situation where it isn't blowing the world up, it's just changing the world for the worse. irreversibly for a long time if we come to war now. Today, word that Tillerson is saying we're willing to open negotiations without preconditions. Did you see that? Just today. And the other day, yesterday, Lavrov on the Russian side, they're willing to negotiate, et cetera, et cetera. Very good. Except that, as somebody pointed out today, and I lived through this, we made proposals for negotiation several times during Vietnam, as you know, with the express expectation that they would come to nothing and that would show we'd gone the last mile and now we had no alternative but to escalate and so forth. And Tillerson, as we know, isn't the last word of influence and power in this administration. And he's been talking negotiation the whole time, actually. So that isn't as reassuring as it could be. And though it is in a good direction, negotiation is the way we should be doing negotiating. But at the same time, on December 4th, for 5 days, we were conducting exercises in Korea. We're sending B-1 bombers, the old B-70, back to, good for almost nothing. They were never good for anything, but except to a show of force across Korea. And actually, not so long ago, B-1s actually wandered across the line as a U-2 went over Russian territory during Vietnam, during Korea, Cuba Missile Crisis. A U-2 went over. And everybody in the Pentagon, then I can say, we all know, we assumed LeMay had done that. And apparently not. The guy really had lost direction, Maltzby, and he wandered over. Oh, one other little detail from this. The Russians send up fighters against the U-2. So we know that from communications and radar. We send up our interceptors against the Russian fighters. And since our interceptors were only good for attacking Russian bombers coming over the pole, that's what they've been working for 20 years, all they had as armaments were Genie rockets armed with nuclear warheads. So had they met the Russian fighters, a nuclear explosion would have gone off. For what? Kennedy didn't know there was a U-2 over there, or that, that there was some prospect. A nuclear explosion over the North Pole, basically. Another one that could set us off. Right now, I read just 2 days ago, the Russians are buzzing our fighters in Iraq. They're supposed to not come. One is on one side of the Euphrates, the other is on the other. They're wandering over into each other's territories. They can get fighting. It isn't just us who are playing these games. There's two insane sets of games. I'm not saying the leaders are insane. I'm not even sure that, this big dispute, is Trump crazy or not, or just pretending to be, for intimidation? Is he really crazy? I'll tell you my own, I said this on The Intercept yesterday. I don't know if it gets through. I said, I don't think he's crazy. I think he's just an asshole. And I wonder, can you, if it's a presidential tape, you can say things like that, Nixon saying, oh, I wouldn't go after the Times, get the goddamn pricks that gave it to him. And I found you can repeat that on AM now. Apparently, if it's the president saying it, So, but I don't know whether I was right, whether I could get through. Whether there's a bleep.
The comment that you
here's where we are.
Yeah, the comment that you just made is very satisfying, evidently, to this audience. But the interesting thing is that we're in a situation now where Trump is actually negotiating or trying to deal with this North Korean situation.
Well, we don't know that. No, Tillerson says we're now prepared to do it. We've really seen nothing yet. We'll see.
But we do know.
I'd be glad if it is.
But we do know that there's acceptance that there's a Chinese role to play, a leadership role, that you need the cooperation of South Korea, Japan, Russia, and so forth. There's a multinational approach, and actually the Democrats are attacking Trump for not being tough enough. And I think the lesson of your book—
On Korea, would you say that?
Yeah, that in other words, they should be putting more pressure. And the thing that is interesting, and I'll end this and we can open up to questions, what is I found compelling about this book is it really doesn't matter who's in charge. That in fact, the situation itself is so fraught with risk, that's so delicate, and no one has thought about it. So the scenario I had, this whole question of the use of weapons. Yeah. We haven't renounced first use. We still have this doomsday machine ready to go. If you have misunderstanding, the Russians still have almost half of the nuclear weapons. We're still dealing with modernization of nuclear weapons. We still believe in survivability, right? So basically,
I'm not sure that's the case, that we believe in. You found that out. You were talking to people like Bush who said, yes, we can win, we can survive. I'm not sure there's anybody in the government now who says we can win or even survive. What they are preparing for is to come out less bad than if we went second. Going first may be a disaster, but less of a disaster than going second, letting them be first, and that is a hoax. It's a delusion. It's a deception. It's not better. It's not worse. It's the same. Right, everybody dies, whichever starts it.
I understand, but I just want to ask you one simple question, and then we'll open it up, okay? Have we, in any demonstrable way, made this world any safer as regards nuclear weapons? Are we, and I'm talking about the mechanics, who has control, what's involved, are we, and forget about that it's Trump. We know that's dangerous, okay? But the fact is we face this danger no matter who is president, okay? And we've considered, as you have documented, using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. We've considered using it a lot of different times, and we have not in any serious way renounced first use. Okay, so what I'm asking is, and we have a situation now, it's not just Korea, we have tension with Russia right now, and they do have their weapons, and we have areas of confrontation. We haven't even mentioned Pakistan and their weapons, which are far more formidable, and so forth. So my question basically is, we've been lulled into a situation all these years that somehow adults were watching the store, and this is getting better. And this book, it seems to me, and it's getting very favorable attention, it's getting good reviews. I thought your interview on Fresh Air was very effective. And I think this book really has the potential of shaping the debate in this country, waking us up to it. That's how I began before I was rudely interrupted. So let me give my pitch again. And that is that the message of this book is not about the missile crisis. It's that we learn nothing from the missile crisis, and that there has not been significant improvement in controlling these weapons, dealing with proliferation, thinking about what they really do, even though the weapons are much more powerful, and what we know about the nuclear winter is much more damning. And so isn't that really the significance of this book?
Yes.
All right, so we have time for a few audience questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
I'm just curious, after books like Command and Control by Eric Schlosser, all the stories in your book, you're a mathematician. I mean, really, what is the probability we're going to be around in 50 years? I mean, it's just insane, the chances of us surviving what's going on with nuclear proliferation and all the dangers that are in the world right now. Do you really think we're going to be around in 50 to 100 years?
I think we have a chance. So I'm an optimist. I don't think it's inevitable that this thing will blow up. It wasn't inevitable that the Titanic would go down. When it started its voyage, who would have said there was any chance? It was thought of as unsinkable. By the way, the owners and the managers and the builders of the Titanic knew it was not unsinkable, but the odds, were very low. 2 days later, 3 days later, they're heading into iceberg regions. They've never been that far south for a long time. So right across their route, And a lot of ships in the vicinity get the same warnings they do. It's not inevitable they go down. None of the other ships did. They all stopped dead in the water at night, or went ahead very slowly, observation, or went south, sharply south. Only the Titanic went down. So was that inevitable? Or on the other hand, was it an accident they hit the iceberg? They went ahead at full speed because they were trying to get a speed record, which they hadn't predicted. They were going to surprise everybody with a supreme on their maiden voyage. The others weren't on their maiden voyage, and they didn't have an owner on board who wanted to set this speed record. So they go ahead full speed toward the icebergs on a dark night, toward the icebergs. You know, if 4 compartments had been flooded, they'd stay up, but 5 compartments were flooded. Okay, we're on the Titanic. That's what I'm saying. It's not inevitable we'll go down, but we are going into iceberg country at full speed, as you were saying. 1.2 billion trillion, let me get a little hard scale here, order of magnitude, $1.2 trillion being spent in the next 30 years on each side to reproduce the Doomsday Machine. It'll really be more than that with inflation. Same kinds of weapons, smaller in number than before. And one big change 30 years ago seemed to be not that the numbers had changed so much, but the Cold War was over. Neither of us was really expecting an attack in 1990s, let's say. And even so, there were 2 false alarms during that period that almost blew the world up after the Cold War. But on the whole, the risks had gone down because we weren't braced and ready, you know, for an attack. We are now going into a new Cold War. And there I would agree with you, the Democrats have been very, very pushing, even complicit on this, more than complicit, pushing Trump, if anything. Why is Trump talking about being friendly with Russia, which I would like to see by the cooperating, whether in Syria or terrorism or climate, various things? Why is he doing that? Simple sanity? Not the first explanation that comes to mind with Trump. But whether he's being blackmailed or he's being hopes of new deals with him or whatever it is, I don't want a Cold War with Russia, which we're getting into. And I don't want hot war, armed conflict by any means. I was very much for Hillary Clinton versus Trump, not any question, but I was very worried that Hillary Clinton's talk of no-fly zones in Syria were going to bring us into direct conflict with Russian planes, which I thought was would be, if she were president now, nearly everything would be better, but we could be in armed conflict with Russia right now, very, very serious, or we'd be on the edge of it. So that particular thing is kind of bipartisan in the sense that they're both moving in this direction. The answer then is, you mentioned Schlosser's book, excellent book on command and control, much more detailed on false alarms and accidents than I had space for in this, and instead I put in a big note about Schlosser and other books like that by Sagan, very important. And those are, even without a Cold War, those are serious accidents. It's crazy to have this system under the command of any human being. Not just the kinds of Americans we've seen. Anybody should not have this kind of system under them. As it is, it'll be a kind of miracle if we get through another 70 years. I think it was a miracle we got through the last 70 years. It'll be another miracle, but fortunately, miracles are possible. The Berlin Wall did come down, the USSR did dissolve, Mandela became president. No one foresaw any of those changes. There has to be a change in consciousness here and norms of a kind we haven't seen for a long time in the world, really. And that's not likely. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible. And if Bob is right, and I would love it if he's right, if this book will contribute to waking people up from sleepwalking toward an abyss, then I will be very happy.
Hi, Mr. Ellsberg. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a question that's not about nuclear weapons, because I'll never get to ask you a question again.
Yeah,
It's been almost 50 years since you leaked the Pentagon
I'm not
Papers.
hearing too well.
It's been almost 50 years since you leaked the Pentagon Papers, and
Yeah.
I just wonder, as you look back on that, what is your impression about the effect that that's had on our country?
That the Pentagon Papers had?
Yes.
The Pentagon Papers, followed by Watergate, made it very clear that as Haldeman, H.R. Haldeman, Chief of Staff to Nixon, said on the second day of the Pentagon Papers, the message of this is very clear. This is an almost exact quote. You can't trust the government. You can't believe anything they say. People will do what they think is wrong because the president orders them to do it, and the president can be wrong. Well, that was Haldeman. That was marvelous. Actually, Haldeman was quoting Donald Rumsfeld, who was in the staff, when he said that. And later I thought, Rumsfeld, smart guy, everybody said was a very smart guy. But on this occasion, no one could have summarized I hope he was right. That's what the message is, and that's what people got. And they did understand from then on, presidents lie. That message got through. We went into Iraq with the same kind of lies that got us into Vietnam, and by Rumsfeld. And how could Rumsfeld, who had seen all this in the Pentagon Papers, have done this? And I later looked back at that quote and I thought, the message for Rumsfeld is, you can get away with it. People will believe, people will follow, even if they know it's wrong. And that's true to this day. So the overall impact, we're sleepwalking, and the nuclear, we never really stopped, basically. That didn't get through. For a while, as we all know, there really was what George H.W. Bush called the Vietnam syndrome, this sickness, this unwillingness to trustfully follow the president into any intervention he wanted. May have kept us out of invading El Salvador, for example, and sending Contras, covertly, not doing what Haig wanted to do. Secretary of State Haig, he wanted to invade on that. It was hard to do for a while. But then, new generation comes along, we forgot. And another thing they all learned from Vietnam was keep the American casualties down. Do it nowadays with drones. We didn't have those till recently. With drones, with air power. The American people learned, as you were saying in World War II, as in the book, they learned that bombing civilians even, they learned at the end of the war, it's what LeMay learned anyway, is the way you win a war. The American people are very tolerant of bombing, as a matter of fact, more than almost any other country. And drones, marvelous. It does seem that the president can just do what he wants. Coming up right now to something that expresses the feeling, and not only for Americans, but for Americans, the predicament the humans are in right now. Senator Lindsey Graham saying that he had heard from the president, and he's saying this proudly. Remember, if we go to war with Korea, the casualties will be all over there. He says, this is an exact quote, thousands of deaths, but they won't be over here. Now, they'll be our allies, South Korea, Japan, and North Korea, not our allies. But South Korea may be wiped out, and Japan will suffer great casualties. So that idea, them, not us. Casualties over there, unfortunately, that persists, and that has to change. If humans are to get away with this, if we're to get out of this, we have to stop the demonization of the other and the lack of concern about the other. We've got to develop a concern for the species and for other living beings, and that's no small change. That's a big change. Are humans capable of living without an other, the enemy, the people to be feared, to be tempted, and remains to be seen. I propose to act as if that were possible.
Let me ask you, follow up on this question with one question. The Washington Post will now be pictured as the great heroic paper. You have a movie, maybe win the Academy Award. You've seen this film, I haven't. But I wonder, is there anything that was in the Pentagon Papers that the Washington Post editors didn't know and couldn't know without the Pentagon Papers? And so what the hell are they doing celebrating the Washington Post for publishing the Pentagon Papers when they should have had all of that information before, and there should have never been a Vietnam War?
Bob, I think from your very special position, you're missing something here, and particularly, let me say what it is. When I say special position, Bob Scheer wrote a piece about the origins of Vietnam. What year was it?
65.
In 65, the year I went to Vietnam. I read it later. Had I read that, there's virtually no chance I would have gone to Vietnam. In part, very specifically, because of the role of my then boss, Ed Lansdale, which I knew nothing about the background in Vietnam at that point. I wouldn't have joined Lansdale's team if I'd read that and if I'd gone over there, for good or bad. You know, the Pentagon Papers wouldn't have come out for what that was worth, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't that I played any critical role in the war, but the Pentagon Papers were useful in some respects. Now, in other words, I'm sitting here with a guy, I don't know anybody else who understood at that point, that early, how we'd gotten in, what the motives, what the interests were, you know, where it was likely to go and so forth. So you look at the Pentagon Papers now and you say, you know, didn't we all know that? And this is what I call, by the way, the Noam Chomsky fallacy, which is, if I know this, everybody knows this. And no, not so. But specifically, what came out was not the revelations that you'd known all along about the histories and everything, but that the government knew it. You didn't know that. I don't believe you knew that. Nobody knew that. It comes back to the first story that I told at such length earlier. The Joint Chiefs knew what they were going to do, 600 million. Except that it was going to be 3 billion, but you know, who's counting? But they knew it. That was the surprise for me. In the case of Vietnam Papers, and a lot of radical critics of the war, like, you know, my friends Noam and Howard Zinn and others, who did know all this stuff. They didn't have much to learn, and I'm sure you didn't have much to learn, except that the people inside were making pretty much the same predictions you were, while they lied. It wasn't that they didn't know what you didn't know, what you knew. They did know it, pretty much. And they were going ahead anyway. They were going full speed toward the icebergs. The Titanic was not without warnings. There were icebergs ahead. Wrong. And the people inside knew. They didn't know all the origins, but the high-level people knew about Geneva, and they knew about Diem assassination, but they knew that we were fighting a continuation of a French colonial war, etc. They knew that, and they were going ahead anyway. Now, why they went ahead is not easy to answer. The Pentagon Papers didn't answer it themselves. They just said they had these predictions, they knew it was a stalemate, and they, at what he was prepared to do, the Joint Chiefs were right, that what we were doing would at best lead to a stalemate. It's often said the Pentagon Papers showed that we knew there was no way to win. No, the Joint Chiefs said over and over again, stupidly, there is a way to win. Do it our way. Blow the place to pieces. The casualties will be over there, right? And that was relatively true. The Viet Cong were not into retaliatory in our country. But they'll be over there, we'll blow them apart. How can they not give up against the United States of America? As stupid as I was when I thought, how can Khrushchev not quickly back off without any real risk here? And actually, he did mean to back off. But he was prepared to keep it going for another day, while the subs were playing games and the U-2s were playing games and everything. And the world could have blown up. So, am I wrong? I think, in other words, That's what did come out. The Washington Post and the Times and the 15 other papers that came out and showed that you can't trust this leadership because even when they know what the radical critics are estimating, they'd rather gamble than admit that there's nothing to do but back down, but to defeat. If Tillerson is right today, that we're going into negotiations without preconditions, that's a major change if Trump comes through with that, because he's been saying now for months, we won't negotiate unless North Korea agrees from the beginning. They will give up their nuclear weapons, which they will not do, absolutely. Now, if we've changed that and he's prepared to accept them as a nuclear state, which is what they are, in order to keep them from getting ICBMs and H-bombs, which they don't have yet, by making concessions to them, concessions such as giving up exercises to invade North Korea, or giving up plans to assassinate Kim Jong-un, which is, on the one hand, not a really good idea to do, because I'm pretty sure that Kim Jong-un has a doomsday machine, not fully nuclear winter, if he's assassinated. A boat against Long Beach Harbor with a nuclear weapon aboard, detonated by a radio device, is something Rand Corporation, our old place here in Santa Monica, analyzed in 2006, 11 years ago. Why then? Because that was the year North Korea first tested a nuclear weapon. So they said, okay, what if they put one of their nuclear weapons on a boat and sailed into Long Beach Harbor? 65,000 dead immediately, 240,000 dead within weeks from radioactivity. Well, that's not the world, you know, but it's you people. And, you know, so, but it's a risk. A risk they're either willing to take or not. And maybe Trump and Tillerson just totally bluffing, and maybe not. But this kind of nuclear chicken is very dangerous.
So let me, this 64 question. Right now, you're become respectable.
In this crowd.
No, because even, you know, when people like Hillary Clinton and Dianne Feinstein have condemned Edward Snowden as a traitor, you're the good whistleblower. You're now the person that says, oh, well, Daniel Ellsberg, okay, now you have a great quote.
Which is not true.
No, I understand that. But you have a great quote from Snowden here. You have visited with Snowden, and you've actually said the really tragedy is you thought when you set this example that there would be others following, doing what any decent person should do. Yeah. You're aware of crimes, war crimes, and you're going to reveal it. And you said until Snowden, right? Chelsea Manning, Snowden, you really hadn't had that example. You've said that the Iraq War, for instance, should have never happened because there should have been some revelation in there right away and so forth. So I just want to ask you, how do you picture your own place in American society now? And with this movie coming out, and there's a documentary on you, and you've got this respectable book, very important book, and success. What about the whistleblower? Why do we have so few? There wasn't anyone else when you did it at RAND or at the Pentagon, right? There was Tony Russo and yourself. So why are whistleblowers so rare?
I've never actually been able to answer why so few. It's not hard to answer why there aren't a whole lot, because being on trial as I was for 115 years, Tony for 35, was meant to cool people down quite a bit in following the example, and undoubtedly did have that effect, and that's understandable. And of course, take right now, Chelsea Manning, 7.5 years, 10.5 months in solitary confinement. Snowden, permanent exile. It's not encouraging, and that's the point that's meant to be made. But even so, take nuclear war, or in Snowden's case, the ripping up of the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, other things, free speech, constant surveillance, Big Brother. Is it worth your life? Well, sure. It should be. It seemed natural to us. I was one of 3 million people, as a civilian, who went to Vietnam. We were all in danger of our lives, well, more or less extent. Nobody thought that was peculiar. It didn't lead to any psychological profiles being done on anybody for that time. It seemed the natural thing to do if you believed the president, that you were doing it to preserve our freedoms. By the way, a very, very grim thought I just had this morning. What war have we been in since World War II, where the soldiers were in fact doing what we thank them for, protecting us at home, preserving our freedom, preserving our liberties? They thought they were, they were told they were. They're 19, 20, 22. They believed that. And, but actually, it wasn't true. And in Vietnam, we saw in the Burns and Novick thing, these people going through horrible combat and so forth. Were they fighting for our freedom in Vietnam? No, actually not. Or in Iraq, you know, etc. So why then, when they are willing, so many people are willing to risk their bodies and their lives when they believe this stuff, as I believe it, are there so few as civilians who are ready to risk their careers or their jobs, you know, or what's been called moral courage, you know, willing to risk ostracism? And the answer is, you know, that's not what you're risking when you go in the service in general. You're risking your body, your life. But be patriotic, believe in the president, et cetera, et cetera. Telling the truth about the president when he's lying or she's lying in the future. And when we have women, we will have women lying presidents, actually. Why is it so rare? I don't really know the answer to that. And it's true, if you'd asked me before Chelsea Manning in 2010, I would say, well, it's been nearly 40 years and I've been asking somebody to do this, you know. So my heart leaped up with Chelsea Manning, then Bradley Manning, when that happened. I said, after 40 years, now somebody's done what I said will make a real difference, which is put out not just one document or not just an oral testimony, but a whole lot of stuff that really makes the point here. And did she put out so much that it might have hurt some people? Yes, that looked possible, but it's been 7 years now. Nobody's come up with a single example. So apparently it wasn't as dangerous as some people thought at the time. Same for Snowden. Was it possible that he would really hurt us in some way? Well, it was 100% sure that he would be said to have damaged us terribly, as he has been by many authorities. But their authority now is well judged by that statement. It's been 4 years with him since 2013. Not one single concrete evidence come up of actual damage from Snowden. But it was possible. Anyway, they did do it. And I must say, this book right here, if I could, I wish I'd put it out in '61 when I had the documents. Or in '71, when I was, when I had them, I copied them in '69. We haven't told the story here, but I lost the documents. I was not proud of that or happy about that, but the documents became lost. A hurricane, which I had not foreseen, dispersed where they had been hidden by my brother. And I was very anguished about that, but I wish I'd put them out before that happened, I have to say. And what would the effect be? I don't know, but I wish I'd tried. Well, my advice to people now who are in a position to, I would love there to be a Me Too site where people who were in the Strategic Air Command, and I would say there must be thousands of people, tens of thousands possibly, of the hundreds of thousands who served. I would guess there were thousands to tens of thousands who knew at the time, and I know some of them, who said, this is insane. What I'm doing is crazy. And they may even say that to the people right around them, and they all agree. Yeah, it's crazy stuff here. But maybe there's a reason for it, but it looks crazy. I would like them to read this historical account and maybe one or two and then more, like the Rose will come out and say, actually, what Ellsberg is saying is what I experienced. Yeah, that's right. We promised not to tell it. We haven't told it, except other people who had clearances. He's right to tell this now. This is what I would love. Snowden said, without the example of seeing the most dangerous man in America film, documentary by Ehrlich and Goldsmith, he would not have done what he did. That gave him the idea that this was the right thing to do. The best feedback I've ever gotten on anything. And before 2010, I had no indication that I'd had that effect on anybody. I'm not aware whether it affected Chelsea or not, frankly. I just heard from her the other day. She's anxious to get together, as I'm anxious. Heard from her yesterday. But I haven't managed to do that. But I did see Snowden. I admire Snowden and Chelsea. I identify with them. Say, I've asked myself, does it seem funny to say, as I often do, they're my heroes, and I identify with them? But the answer to that is, I see in them the best of myself. They acted the way that I best acted, and I do like that.
Okay, and our final question for the evening.
So I would love it if others would come out now, and that would be the best effect I could imagine, except one other now, right now. I thought until Roy Moore, let's say, or until the last couple of months, that my earliest ambition was out of the question. And that was that Congress would investigate these things with subpoenas, with hearings, with testimony, with whistleblowers. But with the Republican Congress, or with the Democratic Congress we saw in the past few years, there seemed no chance of that. That was why I wrote this book, for congressional investigations, when they started out. And then it began to seem, really infeasible. Everything I do is impossible, but some things are of a higher order of impossibility. And to get this Republican Congress to investigate Trump on this didn't seem very promising. But as of now, the 2018 election could give us a House or a Senate that would actually hold hearings on this stuff. And that's up to us to a large extent. And one little tip here, it's got to be better Democrats than we've seen in the past lately. But is that likely? No, it's not likely, but it's not impossible. And that is a goal we really can set ourselves.
All right, let's take our final question for the evening. This is going to be the final question of the evening.
She had her hand up for a long time.
Excuse me. Do you mind?
Yeah, but can we follow with one last?
Yeah,
thank
there's
you. Okay.
the woman in red, as they said.
My question is, first of all, I want to thank you for your moral courage. Okay, we all owe you a big debt. And the question, thank you. The question is, what do you think of the conscientious objectors that went to prison by the thousands?
Well, without the draft resistors, no Pentagon Papers, no Ellsberg. Without their direct example of going to prison to make the strongest case, well, you say the conscientious objector is fine. In World War II, as I recall, they did some alternative service or they went to prison. World War I, the conscientious objectors, prison. And Bertrand Russell, for example, in England. And without the example of the draft resistors who went to prison, just to make as strong a statement as they could that this war is wrong, one shouldn't participate in it, I won't participate even if the alternative is prison. Without that, it wouldn't have occurred to me to ask myself, how can I help shorten this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? Because I did identify with those people. I said, if they can do it, I can do it. And that's the example.
And our final question for the evening.
Yeah, the thing I'm going to walk away from tonight's lecture is the remark you made about Khrushchev and Kennedy, and that you really believed that it was kind of a grandstanding and a blunderbuss, and they were decent enough human beings to maybe, back down at the last minute. And it reminds me of what Sting said, I hope the Russians love their children too. That maybe, and it reminded me of many years ago, I went to a lecture by David Dillinger, who
Go ahead. Friend of mine, yeah.
Who
Dave
gave
Dillinger.
at the end of his lecture, he was from the Chicago 7 conspiracy trial, as you know, he said at the end of his talk that he believed that it was basically the 1%, that it was the top echelons of both countries, the 1% that was basically doing all of this stuff as a way to protect themselves from the rest of us, the 99%. And so that how much of a lot of these wars and a lot of the stuff that's going on really is a defense of the ultra-rich against the poor, is what he was saying.
Okay, all right. To go to your last point, I've increasingly come to think that the Cold War let's say the nuclear arms race to start with, has been above all a massive continuing subsidy to the aerospace industry. And in a larger sense, and I would have gotten this from Bob Scheer much earlier if I had been reading your stuff earlier, not just on Japan, not just on Vietnam, that the Cold War as a whole had a great deal to do with selling arms to our allies, like Germany, and ourselves in particular, the military-industrial complex, and in a broader sense, our hegemony in Europe for largely economic reasons and corporate incentives, and that continues. In other words, the people on the other side of this, as on the climate issue, are the most powerful corporations in the world. Exxon, for God's sake, Secretary of State on this. On climate, dumping the fossil fuel, CO2 into the atmosphere and so forth. What was Tillerson's probably main goal in becoming Secretary of State? I'm going to just speculate here. A $500 billion deal with the Soviets to get oil out of the Soviet Arctic, sell it, burn it, put it in the atmosphere, and we go down and the seas rise, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, that 1/10 of 1%, yes, has enormous influence. You mentioned Dave Dillinger, who became a good friend of mine. His book, actually, a couple of books, he wrote one from Yale to jail, I remember, but maybe that was the one, but another one on, he and Dave McReynolds had another book, Nonviolent
He was a
Revolution.
conscientious objector. Dillinger was a conscientious objector.
Yeah, good, yes. He mentions was a conscientious objector. And, but anyway, he had a big influence on my thinking as I changed. I began to read this stuff. I'll mention though, there was one thing, I loved Dave, he was a wonderful person. And there was one thing I disagreed with him about, and to a degree with my very close friend, whom I also loved, Howard Zinn. They kind of agreed on this point, and I didn't entirely. Maybe I'll end on this. Dave in particular said, if enough people are in the streets, we will end the war. And if there aren't enough people in the streets, it won't. Oh, I'm sorry, this was it. If there's enough people in the streets, even Nixon will end the war, that was it. And if there's not enough people in the streets, even McGovern, would not end the war, that kind of thing. Both of them used that from a point of view which had a lot of influence in my thinking, but which I never fully accepted, which was basically anarchistic view, which was that the voting really didn't matter. And what I was just saying earlier says, the voting is not, the beginning or end of this. You're up against interests here which bipartisan, of course, whoever wins and whatnot. Things tend to go on the same, and they go on in a way that generally is in the interest of the 1% or the 1/10 of 1%. But I agree with them to this extent. The democracy, the democratic procedures don't work without citizen action, organized protest, without the dissent, without these strikes in the 30s, without that. But I think also to say that the voting doesn't matter is also wrong. It's all needed. The lobbying, the voting, it did make a difference I mean, people who said there was no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans and so forth, I know I'm going to disagree with some people right here when I say that, when I say what I'm about to say. But that is, people who said it really doesn't matter which of these people get in there, both represent Wall Street, which is true, they both represent Wall Street, but it doesn't make any difference, so on. That was wrong, and I felt was wrong. So it's all needed. Everything that contributed to ending the Vietnam War and to putting some ceiling on the arms race was essential. The civil disobedience, the sit-ins, the lobby, but also the lobbying, the voting, it did make a difference who was president, though it didn't make as much difference as the candidates said, or as much difference as it should have made, or as much difference as we need, but it does make a difference. We need all of it, and that means that 2018 is more significant a deadline here than I would have thought even months ago.
Thank you very much.